Close your eyes and imagine yourself walking through a golden wheat field at harvest time. The sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and the grain around you sways gently in the evening breeze. The stalks are heavy with seed, bending under the weight of their own abundance. You can hear the soft whisper of wheat touching wheat, a sound like ancient voices telling stories older than memory. The air smells rich and earthy, full of the promise of bread and life. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the sound of reapers finishing their day's work, their songs fading as they head home. You reach out and run your fingers through the grain, feeling each kernel, understanding without words that this simple seed contains the difference between life and death, between feast and famine. As twilight deepens, the field takes on a silvery glow, and you sense the presence of something sacred, something maternal and eternal watching over this harvest. The earth beneath your feet feels solid, generous, giving. You lie down among the stalks, cushioned by the dry ground, looking up at the first stars appearing overhead. The wheat surrounds you like a protective embrace, and you understand that you are part of an ancient cycle, one that has repeated since the beginning of time. The planting, the growing, the harvest, the death of the seed that leads to new life. Rest now, let the earth hold you, and journey with us into the most beautiful and sorrowful story of Greek mythology. The tale of a mother's love so fierce it changed the very nature of the world, and a daughter's transformation that explains why seasons turn and why all things must die to be reborn. Demeter, the great mother of the harvest. Before we can understand the tragedy that would shake Olympus and transform the mortal world forever, we must first understand Demeter herself, who she was, what she represented, and why her grief would have the power to bring all of creation to its knees. Demeter was no minor goddess, no peripheral figure in the Greek pantheon. She was one of the original Olympians, born in the first generation of gods who would rule the cosmos, and her domain was nothing less than life itself. Demeter was the daughter of the titans Cronus and Rhea, which made her sister to some of the most powerful beings in Greek mythology. Her siblings included Zeus, king of gods and lord of the sky, Hera, queen of the gods, Hades, ruler of the underworld, Poseidon, master of the seas, and Hestia, goddess of the hearth. These 6 children of Cronus would become the founding Olympians, the gods who overthrew the Titans and established a new divine order. But Demeter's path to Olympian status was as traumatic as her siblings. Cronus, their father, had been warned by prophecy that one of his children would overthrow him, just as he had overthrown his own father Uranus. To prevent this fate, Cronus did something monstrous. He swallowed each of his children whole as they were born. Demeter, like her siblings, Hestia, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, was consumed by her father and trapped in his belly, conscious but imprisoned in darkness, unable to grow, unable to fulfill her divine purpose. Only Zeus, the youngest, escaped this fate through their mother Rhea's clever substitution of a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes. When Zeus grew to adulthood, he freed his siblings by tricking Cronus into vomiting them up, and together they waged war against the Titans, ultimately claiming Olympus as their domain. This traumatic beginning, being swallowed, trapped, then violently expelled, would echo later in Demeter's mythology. She knew what it meant to lose everything, to be separated from the light and life of the world, to experience powerlessness despite divine nature. Perhaps this early trauma made her fiercely protective of her own children, especially her daughter. Perhaps it made her understand the terror of being taken, trapped, held against your will in darkness. Whatever psychological impact it had, Demeter emerged from the Titanomachy as one of the 12 Olympians, taking her seat among the greatest gods. But unlike her brothers and sisters, who claimed dramatic, obvious domains, Zeus, the thunderbolt, Poseidon, the trident, Hades, the realm of death, Demeter's power was quieter, more fundamental, and ultimately more essential to human existence than all of theirs combined. Demeter was the goddess of agriculture, of grain, of the harvest. She was the goddess of bread, the staple food that kept humanity alive. Without Zeus, mortals might lack divine justice or rain. Without Poseidon, they might struggle with sea travel. But without Demeter, they would simply starve. Every loaf of bread, every cake, every bit of grain that sustained human civilization existed because Demeter allowed it to exist. The ancient Greeks understood this perfectly. They called her by many names and epithets, each revealing a different facet of her immense importance. She was Demeter Thesmophoros, the lawgiver, because agriculture itself required law and order, the knowledge of when to plant, when to harvest, the social organization necessary to farm successfully. She was Demeter Ceto, grain, because she was not just the goddess of grain, but in some sense was grain itself, the living spirit of wheat and barley. She was Demeter Carpophoros, the fruit bearer, recognizing that all cultivated food came from her blessing. She was Demeter Eleusinia, named for the great mystery cult at Eleusis, where she would be worshipped for thousands of years. Demeter had several children by different fathers, each representing some aspect of abundance or wealth derived from the earth. With the mortal Iation, a Cretan hero, she conceived Plutus, the god of wealth and abundance. Not the wealth of gold and silver, but the wealth of agricultural plenty, the true riches that came from bountiful harvests. Ancient sources tell us this union took place in a thrice plowed field, emphasizing the agricultural nature of the relationship and resulting deity, with Poseidon in a union that mythology describes variously as consensual or forced. Demeter bore 2 children, Despoina, a mysterious goddess whose true name was revealed only to initiates of her cult, and Arion, a magnificent horse gifted with human speech and supernatural speed. The story of this union tells us much about Demeter. When Poseidon pursued her with unwanted attention, she transformed herself into a mare to escape him, but he became a stallion and caught her anyway. A tale that speaks to the vulnerability even goddesses could experience. But of all Demeter's children, one stood above the rest in importance, in love, and ultimately in the shaping of her mythology and the world itself. With her brother Zeus, king of the gods, Demeter bore a daughter whom they named Persephone, though in her youth she was known simply as Kore, the maiden, the daughter, the girl. This child, born from the union of agricultural goddess and sky god, from earth's fertility and heaven's power, would become the center of Demeter's existence, the embodiment of spring and renewal, and the cause of the greatest grief any mother in Greek mythology would endure. Demeter's worship was widespread throughout the ancient Greek world, because her blessings were literally a matter of life and death. Bad harvests meant famine, starvation, death. Good harvests meant survival. prosperity, continuation of family lines and communities. Every farmer who planted seed, every household that baked bread, every community that celebrated harvest was engaging in acts that honored Demeter, whether they made formal sacrifice or not. But formal worship of Demeter was elaborate and important throughout Greece. The Thesmophoria was one of the most important and ancient festivals dedicated to Demeter, celebrated only by women across the Greek world every autumn. This women-only festival lasted 3 days and involved secret rites that men were absolutely forbidden from witnessing. The Thesmophoria celebrated fertility, agriculture, and the sacred bonds between women, all under Demeter's protection. Women would carry piglets into underground chambers where they would be left to decompose, mixing with seed and grain, and then later this mixture would be retrieved and scattered on fields to ensure fertility, a powerful ritual recognizing the connection between death, decomposition, and new life. Other festivals honored Demeter throughout the year. The Haloa celebrated the threshing and storage of grain, beginning in Athens but concluding at Eleusis. The Thalisia was a Thanksgiving festival held after harvest in the island of Kos and other locations, expressing gratitude for successful crops. The Chthoniya at Hermione in Argolis honored Demeter in her aspect as an underworld deity, recognizing that grain disappeared into the earth before sprouting, that the goddess who gave life from earth also had dominion over what lay beneath it. This chthonic aspect of Demeter, her connection to the underworld, would become tragically important when her daughter was taken below. Demeter's sacred symbols reflected her agricultural dominion. She was depicted holding sheaves of wheat or barley, the grains that sustained human civilization. The poppy, bright red and growing wild in grain fields, was her flower, both because poppies appeared naturally among crops, and because their sleep-inducing properties recall the story of how Demeter was given poppy to help her rest during her grief-filled wandering. Torches were also her symbol, relating to her frantic search for her daughter that we'll explore in detail. The pig was her sacred animal because pigs were commonly sacrificed to her and because pigs root in the earth, connecting them to agricultural cycles. More surprisingly, serpents were also associated with Demeter, perhaps because snakes live in the earth, perhaps because they shed their skin and renew themselves, echoing the death and rebirth of planted seeds. In art and sculpture, Demeter was typically portrayed as a mature, dignified woman, matronly and full-figured in a way that spoke of fertility and abundance. She wore a crown or wreath of wheat, sometimes held a torch or scepter, and often carried a cornucopia overflowing with the fruits of the earth. Her appearance was meant to evoke maternal nurturing, the generosity of nature, the patient wisdom of earth itself. She looked like a mother, and indeed motherhood was perhaps the most essential aspect of her character, at least in her most famous myth. But Demeter could also be terrifying. The goddess who gave life could withhold it. The mother who nurtured could destroy. Ancient sources sometimes called her Demeter Erinis, the Avenger, or Demeter Maligna, the Black One, epithets that emphasized her darker aspect. When angered or grieving, Demeter had the power to make the earth barren, to cause crops to fail, to bring famine and death to humanity. This capacity for destruction, this darker face of the nurturing goddess, would manifest in the most dramatic possible way when her daughter was stolen from her The center of Demeter's worship, the place where her mythology would be enacted and celebrated for 2,000 years, was the sanctuary at Eleusis, a town about 14 miles northwest of Athens. Here, according to myth, Demeter herself had come during her wandering, had been welcomed, had revealed her divine nature, and had established the mysteries that would make Eleusis one of the most important religious sites in the ancient world. The Eleusinian mysteries, which we'll discuss in detail later, promised initiates a blessed afterlife, and were based entirely on the story of Demeter and her daughter, the story of loss and reunion, death and rebirth, grief and hope. Demeter's character, as the Greeks understood her, combined fierce maternal love with the patient, cyclical wisdom of agriculture. She was nurturing but not soft, generous but capable of withholding her gifts, maternal but powerful enough to challenge even Zeus. She represented the Earth's fertility, yes, but also the Earth's potential barrenness. She was life-giver and life-withholder, and this duality made her one of the most complex and important goddesses in the Greek pantheon. Everything in her mythology would revolve around the central fact of her nature. She was, above all else, a mother who loved her daughter with an intensity that could move the cosmos itself. Persephone, the maiden core. To understand the tragedy that would shatter Demeter's world, we must also understand her daughter, the young goddess known in her youth as Kore, a name that simply meant the maiden or the girl. Before she became Persephone, queen of the underworld, before she became associated with death and darkness, she was simply Kore, spring itself in divine form, youth, beauty, and innocence embodied, the promise of new life after winter's death. Persephone, daughter of Demeter and Zeus, was born into complicated divine circumstances. Her father was the king of gods, but Zeus was notorious for his many affairs and his frequent absence from his children's lives. Her mother was intensely devoted, perhaps overprotective, certainly determined that her daughter would remain safe and pure. Persephone grew up primarily in her mother's care, learning the mysteries of agriculture and growth, understanding the cycles of planting and harvest, embodying the aspect of spring that makes seeds sprout and flowers bloom. In her youth, Persephone was the goddess of spring growth and vegetation, the divine force that made flowers open and young plants push through soil towards sunlight. She represented that first emergence of life after winter's dormancy, the moment when the earth stops being barren and begins to bloom again. Everything about her was associated with beginnings, with youth, with fresh beauty. She was, in every sense, a maiden goddess, chaste, untouched, eternally young, full of potential, but not yet matured into her full power. Ancient sources describe Persephone's beauty in terms that make clear why she attracted so much divine attention. She was breathtakingly lovely, with the fresh beauty of spring itself. Multiple gods desired her, including Hermes, Ares, Apollo, and Hephaestus. But Demeter fiercely guarded her daughter, keeping her away from potential suitors, determined that Persephone would remain maiden forever like Artemis or Athena. In some versions of the mythology, Demeter even hid Persephone away from Olympus, keeping her on Earth where her mother could protect her from the advances of gods who saw her beauty and wanted to possess it. Persephone's nature was gentle, innocent, trusting. She spent her time in meadows and fields, gathering flowers, playing with nymphs. enjoying the simple pleasures of youth. She was associated with particular flowers, especially the narcissus, whose role in her abduction would be crucial, but also crocus, violet, rose, lily, all the beautiful blooms of spring. She moved through the world without fear or suspicion, not understanding yet that beauty could be dangerous, that desire could be predatory, that innocence itself could mark her as a target. The nymphs and minor goddesses who accompanied Kore were often named in ancient sources. She played with the daughters of the ocean god Oceanus, those multitudinous oceanids who personified springs and rivers. In some versions, she was joined by Artemis and Athena themselves, the two great virgin goddesses. These companions represented the safe, female space that Demeter tried to create for her daughter, a world of women and girls, protected from male attention and violence, where innocence could be preserved indefinitely. But this innocence, this protected status, could not last forever. Greek culture understood that maidenhood was a temporary state, that every core must eventually become something else: wife, mother, woman. The transition from maiden to married woman was called marriage in the social sense, but in psychological and mythological terms, it was understood as a kind of death, a loss of the girlhood self, an end to innocence. The Greeks sometimes referred to marriage as taming a girl, and wedding imagery often paralleled death imagery. A maiden died and a wife was born in her place. In Persephone's case, this transition would be far more literal and violent than usual, but it reflected real anxieties Greek culture had about female development and the loss daughters represented to their mothers. When girls married in ancient Greece, they typically left their mothers' homes as early as 12 or 13 years old, moving to their husbands' households, where they would be under male authority. Mothers lost their daughters to marriage. Daughters were separated from mothers by men who claimed ownership rights over them. The Demeter Persephone myth would explore this universal experience of mother-daughter separation through the lens of divine tragedy. Persephone's status as Kore, as eternal maiden, represented something precious and precarious. She was potential not yet realized, beauty not yet claimed, life not yet fully begun. She existed in that liminal space between childhood and adulthood, between protection and exposure, between safety and danger. And, like all liminal states, her maidenhood could not last. Change was coming, transformation was inevitable, even if neither she nor her mother wanted it. The duality of Persephone's nature was already present, even before her abduction. As goddess of spring growth, she was associated with life emerging from earth, seeds sprouting upward toward light, flowers blooming, young plants growing, but she was also associated with what goes into the earth. Seeds planted, bulbs buried, the necessary descent before growth can occur. Spring's beauty comes from winter's death. New life rises from decay. Persephone embodied this paradox, even as innocent Kore, though she didn't yet understand it. She represented the life that comes from earth, but also the death that seeds must undergo to become plants. Her relationship with her mother was central to her identity. Demeter and Kore were inseparable, often worshipped together as the two goddesses, the older and the younger, mother and maiden. They represented the generational continuity of life, the way mothers produce daughters who will become mothers themselves, the endless cycle of birth and nurture and birth again. but they also represented the intense emotional bond between mothers and daughters, the way mothers see themselves in their daughters, the way daughters define themselves through and against their mothers. Greek culture recognized this bond as uniquely powerful and potentially problematic. Mothers could be overprotective, refusing to let daughters grow up. Daughters could be trapped in maidenhood, never allowed to develop independent identity. The separation that marriage necessitated was painful for both parties, yet it was also understood as necessary. Daughters had to leave mothers, maidens had to become women, children had to grow up even if parents wished they wouldn't. The Demeter Persephone myth would take this normal, painful process and heighten it into cosmic tragedy, exploring what happens when a mother's love refuses to accept necessary loss, when a daughter's transformation is violent rather than gentle, when separation feels like death because, in mythological terms, it is death. Before the abduction, Kor was simply a girl, albeit a divine one, beautiful, innocent, beloved, protected, full of the thoughtless joy of spring itself. She gathered flowers without understanding that beauty could be bait. She played in meadows without knowing that the earth could open beneath her feet. She trusted the world because her mother had made the world safe for her. And that innocence, that trust, that sense of security would be shattered in a single moment when a god decided he wanted her, and another god gave permission for her to be taken. To resume the abduction, when the earth opened, the catastrophe that would change everything, that would transform innocent Kor into queenly Persephone, that would turn Demeter from nurturing goddess into agent of devastation, that would bring famine to the world and establish the cycle of seasons, began on an ordinary day, in an ordinary meadow with an extraordinary flower. The ancient Greeks, masters of dramatic irony, understood that the worst tragedies come from moments of happiness, that disaster strikes when we least expect it, when we are most innocent and most vulnerable. Persephone was playing in a meadow, gathering flowers as she often did. Ancient sources disagree slightly on the exact location. Some say it was on Sicily, that fertile island sacred to Demeter. Others place it near the town of Enna. Still others locate it in Nysa, a mythical place associated with several important Greek myths. The specific geography doesn't matter as much as the type of place. A meadow, lush and flower-filled, protected and peaceful. Exactly the sort of place a young goddess might feel safe. She was not alone. Her companions that day included various nymphs, nature spirits who served as attendants to the young goddess. Some sources specifically name the Oceanids, daughters of the ocean titan Oceanus. In some versions of the story, Artemis and Athena themselves were present, those two great virgin goddesses. The presence of these companions makes the subsequent events even more shocking. Persephone was not isolated, not unguarded. She was surrounded by other divine beings who should have been able to protect her. Yet they could not and would not prevent what was about to happen. The meadow was filled with flowers: iris, rose, violet, crocus, and other blooms traditional in Greek meadows. But then Persephone noticed one flower that stood out from all the rest, that caught her attention in a way no other had. The ancient texts describe this flower carefully, emphasizing its unusual nature. It was a narcissus, but not an ordinary one. This narcissus had 100 blooms sprouting from a single root, more magnificent than any narcissus ever seen before. Its scent was intoxicating, filling the entire meadow with sweetness. Even the heavens and earth seemed to smile at its beauty. The ancient Homeric hymn to Demeter tells us, Persephone, drawn by the flower's extraordinary beauty, reached out to pluck it. Her fingers closed around the stem, and in that moment, the moment her hand touched the flower, the earth split open beneath her feet. This was no accident. The narcissus had been placed there deliberately as a trap. In most versions, Zeus himself, Persephone's father, had arranged for this flower to grow in that exact spot at that exact time, as a lure to draw his daughter away from her companions and make her vulnerable to what came next. In some versions, Gaia, the earth herself, caused the flower to grow at Zeus's command. The flower was beaked, designed specifically to attract Persephone and isolate her at the crucial moment. It was beautiful, irresistible, and deadly, like so many traps that catch the innocent. As the earth opened, everything happened with terrifying speed. From the chasm burst Hades, lord of the underworld, driving a golden chariot pulled by immortal horses. Some sources describe these horses as black, others as dark blue or silver, but all agree they were supernatural, able to travel between worlds. Born from night and able to gallop through the darkness of the earth, the chariot itself gleamed with gold and gems, the paradoxical wealth of the underground where precious metals and stones lie hidden. Hades saw Persephone and did not hesitate. He seized the young goddess, pulling her into his chariot, despite her resistance and terror. Ancient sources are clear that this was rape, in the ancient Greek sense meaning both sexual violation and violent abduction. Persephone did not go willingly. She screamed, calling for help, crying out for her father Zeus and her mother Demeter. The Homeric hymn describes her cry echoing across the cosmos, through the depths of the sea and up to the heights of heaven. But Zeus, who should have protected his daughter, said nothing, did nothing. He was nowhere to be seen. And there was a reason for this. A betrayal that would make Demeter's eventual rage even more justified. Zeus had approved the abduction. In fact, Zeus had arranged it. Hades, lord of the dead, had fallen in love with Persephone's beauty and asked his brother Zeus for permission to marry her. Zeus, perhaps seeing political advantage in the alliance, perhaps simply operating by patriarchal assumptions that fathers had the right to dispose of their daughters, gave his consent. He gave Persephone to Hades without bothering to inform the bride or her mother, without considering whether either of them might have objections to this arrangement. This was not unusual by ancient Greek standards, where marriages were typically arranged by fathers without consulting daughters. But the mythology recognizes it as wrong anyway, as betrayal, as violation. Zeus's complicity in his daughter's abduction would be a crucial element of the story, creating a conflict not just between Demeter and Hades, but between Demeter and Zeus, between mother and father, over who had rights to their daughter's future. The nymphs who were with Persephone saw nothing. By the time they realized something was wrong, the earth had already closed again, sealing itself back over the chasm, leaving no trace of where Persephone had gone. Only her screams remained, echoing across the cosmos. Two divine beings heard those screams and understood what had happened. Hecate, goddess of witchcraft and crossroads, was in her cave and heard Persephone's cry, but did not see who took her or where she went. And Helios, the sun god, who sees everything from his position in the sky, witnessed the entire abduction, but chose not to interfere. Later, these two would be crucial witnesses, but in the moment of crisis, neither intervened to help. In one ancient version of the story preserved by Apollodorus, the earth did not just open beneath Persephone, it opened while she was in the act of picking that narcissus flower, so that she fell downward, following the flower stem into the chasm, as if the flower itself was pulling her into the underworld. This detail is both literally terrifying and metaphorically perfect. Beauty leads to danger. Desire pulls us toward our own undoing. The act of reaching for what we want opens the ground beneath our feet. Hades drove his chariot downward through the earth, taking Persephone away from sunlight, away from open air, away from meadows and flowers and spring, into his dark kingdom. The journey to the underworld was swift and violent. Persephone fought and screamed the entire way, but the god who held her was stronger. The horses that pulled the chariot were supernatural, and the underworld's pull was irresistible. She was taken from the world of the living to the world of the dead, from light into darkness, from freedom into captivity, from maidenhood into forced wifehood. Ancient sources emphasize Persephone's terror and resistance. This was not a love story where a girl is swept away by a handsome god and lives happily ever after. This was abduction, captivity, rape in the ancient sense. The mythology doesn't predify what happened to Persephone. It acknowledges her trauma, her violated innocence, the violence done to her against her will. She was a young goddess who had done nothing wrong, hurt no one, whose only crime was being beautiful in the sight of a powerful male deity who wanted her and could take her because no one would stop him. The symbolism of the abduction is rich and complex. On one level, it represents the reality of marriage in ancient Greece, where young girls were often given in marriage to much older men without their consent, moving from their mother's houses to their husband's control, experiencing this transition as a kind of death of their former selves. On another level, it represents the loss of innocence that every person experiences when they move from childhood into adult knowledge of danger, sexuality, and death. On yet another level, it symbolizes the agricultural cycle. Persephone as seed, stolen from the surface world, buried in dark earth, undergoing death so that new life can eventually emerge. But the myth doesn't let us simply accept these symbolic readings and move on. It forces us to sit with the horror of what happened. A young girl was violently abducted, taken from everything and everyone she knew, dragged into darkness and captivity. Her screams echoed across the cosmos, but no one came to help her. Her father had sold her to his brother without her knowledge. Her mother wasn't there to protect her. All her companions were powerless to save her, and the earth itself betrayed her, opening beneath her feet and then closing again, leaving no trace, no way to follow. This is the moment when Kor, the innocent maiden, began to die. In her place, someone new would eventually emerge, Persephone, queen of the dead, powerful in ways Kor never was, mature in ways Kor never could have been, changed utterly and forever by trauma and transformation. But that transformation would be violent, painful, and would exact costs that reverberate through all mythology. The abduction of Persephone was not the beginning of a love story. It was the beginning of the greatest tragedy in Greek mythology. a tragedy that would bring the entire world to the edge of death before it was resolved. A mother's unending grief. Demeter heard the scream. From wherever she was, the ancient sources don't specify her exact location at the fatal moment. The goddess heard her daughter's cry echoing across the cosmos. Every mother knows the sound of her child in distress, and Demeter knew instantly that something terrible had happened to Persephone. She dropped whatever she was holding, cast aside whatever divine business had occupied her, and began to search for her daughter with the single-minded intensity that only a mother in crisis can muster. But Persephone was nowhere to be found. The meadow where she had been playing showed no signs of struggle. The nymphs who had been with her could tell Demeter nothing useful. They hadn't seen what happened, didn't know where Persephone had gone. There was no trail to follow, no ransom note, no divine message explaining the disappearance. Persephone had simply vanished, as if the earth itself had swallowed her. In a very real sense, it had. For 9 days and 9 nights, Demeter searched. She did not eat. She did not drink. She did not sleep. She did not bathe or rest or tend to her own needs. Like any mother whose child has vanished, she could think of nothing except finding her daughter, bringing her home, making everything right again. She carried torches to light her way as she searched through the darkness, and those torches would become one of her primary symbols in later worship. She scoured the earth, looking in every place she could imagine Persephone might be, calling her daughter's name until her voice grew hoarse. Ancient sources emphasize the completeness of Demeter's focus during this search. She who had been the goddess of agriculture, who had blessed all growing things, who had cared for the earth's fertility, abandoned all those duties. She who had been generous and nurturing became single-minded and desperate. Nothing mattered except finding Persephone. The crops could wait. The harvest could wait. Humanity's needs could wait. A mother's child was missing, and until that child was found, nothing else in the cosmos had any importance whatsoever. On the 10th day, Demeter encountered Hecate, the mysterious goddess associated with crossroads, magic, and the dark of the moon. Hecate had been in her cave when she heard Persephone scream, though she hadn't seen who took her or where. But Hecate suggested that Helios, the sun god, would know. He sees everything that happens in the light of day. Helios, after all, had been in the sky at the moment of Persephone's abduction. If anyone had witnessed what happened, it would be him. Demeter went to Helios and demanded the truth. The sun god, immortal witness to all that transpires under heaven, could not lie to her. He told her everything. Yes, he had seen what happened. Yes, he knew where Persephone was. Hades, lord of the underworld, had taken her to be his wife. The earth had opened. Hades had seized the girl. The earth had closed again. Persephone was now in the realm of the dead, beyond the reach of the living, claimed as bride by one of the 3 great sons of Cronus. And then Helios revealed the most devastating detail of all. Zeus had approved the abduction. Persephone's own father, Demeter's brother, the king of gods who was supposed to maintain justice and order, had given Hades permission to take the girl. This was not some random act of violence that could be blamed on Hades alone. This was conspiracy, betrayal at the highest level. Zeus had essentially sold his daughter without consulting her mother, without considering his daughter's wishes. without caring about the pain he would inflict. Demeter's grief transformed into rage. She was furious with Hades, yes, for the abduction, but she was even more furious with Zeus for the betrayal. Her brother, her former lover, the father of her child, had conspired to take that child from her. He had used his authority as king of gods to give her daughter to his brother had treated Persephone like property to be distributed among male relatives without thought for the girl herself or for her mother's rights. The patriarchal assumptions underlying this decision, that fathers owned daughters, that male gods could dispose of female relatives, that mothers had no say in their daughters' fates, were made explicitly clear. Demeter immediately went to Olympus to confront Zeus, to demand he order Hades to return Persephone. But Zeus refused. The marriage had been agreed upon, he said. Hades was an appropriate match, powerful, wealthy. The earth's underground riches all belonged to him. One of the three brothers who ruled the cosmos. Zeus saw no problem with the arrangement and would not intervene. As far as he was concerned, the matter was settled. Persephone now belonged to Hades. This refusal, this dismissal of a mother's anguish and a daughter's autonomy pushed Demeter past the breaking point. If Zeus would not help her, if the king of gods cared so little for his own daughter and his own sister, then Demeter wanted nothing more to do with Olympus. She abandoned the divine realm, disguised herself as an old mortal woman, and wandered the earth alone with her grief and rage, searching for her daughter and refusing to return to her divine duties. The disguise Demeter adopted is significant. She appeared as an old woman past childbearing years, someone life had used hard, someone familiar with sorrow. She wore dark mourning clothes. Her once beautiful face was haggard with grief. She looked like what she was, a mother who had lost her child and been broken by that loss. In this guise, anonymous and apparently powerless, she wandered through the mortal world, perhaps finding some comfort in being among those who also knew loss and grief, who would not dismiss her pain as Zeus had done. In her wandering, Demeter eventually arrived at Eleusis, the town that would become central to her worship. Disguised as an elderly woman, she sat down to rest by a well called the Maiden's Well, near a sacred olive tree. Local girls came to draw water and found this sad, tired old woman sitting alone. Being kind-hearted, they asked who she was and if she needed help. Demeter, still in disguise, told them she was a woman named Doso, that she had been kidnapped by pirates and had escaped, and now she needed work. The girls brought her to their mother, Queen Metaneira, who offered Demeter a position as nurse to Demephon, the queen's infant son. Demeter accepted. She entered the household of King Celeus and Queen Metaneira, and took on the role of caring for their baby. The goddess, who had lost her own daughter, became nurse to someone else's son, pouring her maternal love into this mortal child since she could not care for her own. The royal family treated her with kindness and respect, gave her a place in their household, tried to make her smile, though they could not understand the depth of her sorrow. In gratitude for their kindness, Demeter decided to give the family an extraordinary gift. She would make their son immortal. Each night, when everyone else slept, Demeter would hold baby Demephon and place him in the fire, burning away his mortal nature, replacing it, bit by bit, with divine immortality. The child thrived under this treatment, growing stronger and more beautiful each day. not eating food because he was being sustained by divine ambrosia that Demeter anointed him with. But one night, Queen Metanera saw what Demeter was doing. She saw this old woman holding her baby in flames and, not understanding the divine nature of the act, screamed in terror and rushed to save her child. Demeter pulled Demophon from the fire, furious that the process had been interrupted. She revealed her true nature in that moment, shedding her old woman's disguise, growing to her full divine height, shining with celestial radiance, terrifying the entire household with the majesty and power of her divinity. Demeter raged at Metanera for interrupting the ritual. The child had been on the path to immortality, she explained, but now that path was closed. Demophon would live a long and prosperous life, but he would remain mortal and eventually die. Then Demeter commanded the people of Eleusis to build her a great temple where she would dwell and where she would teach them her sacred rites. If she could not have her daughter, if she could not return to Olympus, she would stay here among mortals who had shown her kindness, and she would wait, and she would mourn, and she would make the entire world understand her pain. The people of Eleusis built the temple as commanded, a beautiful structure dedicated to the grieving goddess, and Demeter withdrew into it, cutting herself off from gods and mortals alike, sitting in solitude with her grief and rage, refusing to be comforted, refusing to give up her anger, refusing to accept what had happened to her daughter. A mother's love, when pushed to extremes by loss, becomes a force that nothing can resist and no one can control. Demeter's grief was about to demonstrate this truth in the most dramatic and devastating way possible. If Zeus thought he could dismiss her pain, if the gods thought they could ignore a mother's anguish, they were about to learn how wrong they were. When you hurt a mother by taking her child, you make an enemy whose rage can shake the world itself. The world withers, famine and desperation. Demeter sat in her newly built temple at Eleusis and made a decision that would alter the face of the world. She who had always blessed the earth's fertility, who had taught humanity agriculture, who had ensured that crops grew and harvest came and people did not starve, she withdrew all those blessings. If her daughter would not grow and bloom, then neither would anything else. If Persephone was trapped in the darkness of death, then all living things would begin to die. Until Zeus returned her daughter, Demeter would let the world understand exactly what it meant to live without the goddess of agriculture's favor. The effects were immediate and catastrophic. Seeds that farmers planted did not sprout. Plants that had been growing withered and died. Trees that should have bloomed remained barren. Grass turned brown and crumbled to dust. Gardens became wastes. Fields that should have been green with grain lay dead and empty. For the first time in human history, nothing grew. The earth, usually so generous under Demeter's care, became as barren and lifeless as the underworld itself. This was the first winter, not winter as a season, because the ancient Greeks had not known seasons as we understand them before this moment, but winter as the absence of growth, the death of vegetation, the time when earth lies dormant and dead. The ancient sources describe it as a terrible year, perhaps the worst year humanity had ever experienced. Where there had always been plenty, suddenly there was scarcity. Where crops had always grown, now nothing would sprout. Where food had been abundant, now there was famine. Without grain for bread, without vegetables from gardens, without fruits from trees, humans began to starve. Hunger spread across the entire world because Demeter's power was not local but universal. She was goddess of agriculture everywhere, not just in Greece, and her withdrawal of blessing affected all humanity. Families consumed their stores of grain from previous harvests, then had nothing left. Livestock starved because there was no grass or fodder to feed them. Animals grew thin and died. Children cried with hunger. The old and weak began to perish from malnutrition. This was famine on a scale the world had never seen, caused by the deliberate action of a goddess whose grief had transformed into destructive rage. But Demeter's strike against the world was aimed primarily at the gods, not at humans. She understood the divine economy. Gods depended on sacrifices from mortals. When humans made offerings to the gods, burning the fat and bones of sacrificed animals, the smoke and scent rose to heaven as food for the divine. This was how gods and humans maintained their relationship, through reciprocal gift-giving. Humans received divine blessings. Gods received sacrifices in return. But when humans had no food for themselves, they certainly had no surplus to sacrifice to gods. When the livestock died, there were no animals to sacrifice. The smoke of offerings that constantly rose from altars across the world began to thin and then stopped entirely. The gods grew concerned. At first, perhaps they noticed only the absence of sacrificial smoke and wondered idly why mortals had stopped honoring them properly. But as the famine continued and deepened, as it became clear that humanity was actually in danger of extinction, the gods began to understand the severity of the situation. If all humans died, there would be no more sacrifices, no more worship, no more acknowledgement of divine power. The gods needed humans, depended on them in their own way, and Demeter's strike was threatening to destroy that entire relationship. Zeus began to realize the magnitude of the problem he had created. By casually giving Persephone to Hades without considering Demeter's reaction, he had triggered a crisis that threatened the entire order of existence. One by one, he sent messengers to Eleusis to try to convince Demeter to relent, to end the famine, to return to Olympus, and resume her duties. He sent Iris, the rainbow goddess, who served as his herald. He sent other gods and goddesses to plead with Demeter, offering her gifts, honors, new privileges, if she would only stop destroying the world. But Demeter refused them all. To each divine messenger she gave the same answer. She would not set foot on Olympus. She would not allow a single grain to sprout from the earth. She would not end the famine until Zeus returned her daughter to her. Not gifts, not honors, not threats, not pleading would move her. She had one demand, non-negotiable and absolute. Bring Persephone back. Until that happened, the world could starve. Humanity could perish. The gods could go without sacrifices. She did not care. She was a mother who had lost her child, and until that child was restored, nothing else mattered. This is one of the most powerful moments in Greek mythology. A goddess defying the king of gods, using her power not to fight him directly, but to hurt what he cared about, forcing him to acknowledge her needs and her rights as equal to his own. Zeus was the most powerful god, but Demeter had power too, power Zeus could not override or ignore. She controlled something fundamental to existence, food itself, the basis of all life. Without her cooperation, The world Zeus ruled would become a dead wasteland. She'd found the one form of leverage that could force even Zeus to yield. Imagine that first winter stretching on and on. Imagine farmers staring at dead fields, unable to understand why the soil that had always rewarded their labor now produced nothing. Imagine mothers trying to feed hungry children with dwindling supplies, stretching every grain of wheat, watching their babies grow thin. Imagine communities that had always been self-sufficient suddenly facing starvation. Imagine the prayers rising to the gods, begging for relief, asking what sin they had committed to deserve this punishment. Imagine the desperation, the fear, the slow realization that this might not end, that everyone might actually die. The ancient Greeks, living in a world where agriculture was life and crop failure meant death, would have understood this famine in visceral, terrifying terms. They knew what it was to depend entirely on the earth's fertility, to live or die based on whether crops grew or failed. A bad harvest was disaster. Total crop failure everywhere was apocalypse. Demeter's strike demonstrated in the most dramatic way possible what humanity owed to the goddess of grain, how completely dependent mortals were on divine blessing for their survival. But the famine also demonstrated something else: the power of maternal love and grief. Demeter was not doing this out of casual cruelty or divine whim. She was doing it because her daughter had been stolen and no one would help her get that daughter back. She was doing it because Zeus had dismissed her pain, because Hades had violated her daughter, because the male gods thought they could do whatever they wanted to female gods, and goddesses would simply have to accept it. She was showing them the cost of that assumption. She was making them understand that a mother's grief was not something to be dismissed or ignored, that maternal love was a force as powerful as Zeus's thunderbolt, or Poseidon's earthquake, or Hades' grip on the dead. Eventually, finally, Zeus had to admit defeat. He could not force Demeter to relent. He could not override her power over agriculture. He could not allow humanity to die because that would mean the end of divine worship and the divine order itself. He had to give Demeter what she wanted. He had to try to return Persephone, even though by all the rules of divine politics and patriarchal authority, he should not have to, even though he had given his consent to Hades and should not have to take it back. Zeus sent Hermes, messenger of the gods, guide of souls, the one god who could move freely between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Hermes was commanded to go to the underworld, speak with Hades, and bring Persephone back to her mother. The famine had to end. Humanity had to survive. The gods needed their sacrifices. And if that meant Zeus had to reverse his decision, had to overrule his brother Hades, had to acknowledge that Demeter's demands were more important than his own pride, well, so be it. But nothing in Greek mythology is ever simple or straightforward, and the resolution of this crisis would prove to be more complicated than anyone expected. Persephone had been in the underworld for months now, and the underworld changes those who dwell there. She was not the same girl who had been abducted from the meadow. She had eaten food from the realm of the dead, and that single act, that small, seemingly insignificant choice, would mean that neither Demeter nor Zeus nor anyone else could have fully undo what Hades had done. Persephone in the underworld. Transformation, while Demeter searched and grieved and raged, while the world above withered and died. Persephone experienced her own transformation. In the darkness of the underworld, the innocent maiden who had been abducted from a sunlit meadow was thrust into a realm utterly unlike anything she had known, a place of shadows and silence, of the dead and the dying, of darkness so complete that memory of sunlight seemed like a dream. The underworld that Persephone entered was not the Christian hell of later tradition, but it was no paradise either. It was simply the place where all the dead went, good and bad alike, to exist as shades, pale shadows of their former selves, conscious but without substance, aware but without joy. The rivers of the underworld flowed past her. The Styx, the river of hate that the gods swore their most binding oaths upon. The Acheron, the river of pain. The Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, whose waters made souls forget their former lives. The Phlegethon, the river of fire. And the Cocytus, the river of wailing where souls lamented their fate. Hades himself ruled this realm from his dark palace, surrounded by wealth because all precious metals and gems lay beneath the earth in his domain, yet isolated from the world of life and light. He was not an evil god in Greek understanding. He was stern, implacable, and just, but not cruel for the sake of cruelty. He ruled the dead fairly, keeping order in his dark kingdom, ensuring that souls stayed where they belonged. But he was also lonely. Of the three great sons of Cronus who divided the cosmos between them, Zeus taking the sky, Poseidon the seas, Hades the underworld. Hades had drawn the least desirable lot. He dwelled in darkness while his brothers lived in light. He was feared and avoided while they were honored and celebrated. No one willingly came to his realm. Even the other gods did not visit him. Until he saw Persephone, until he decided he wanted her, Hades had apparently accepted his solitary lot. But seeing her beauty, her vitality, her association with spring and growth and life, he wanted desperately to possess those qualities, to bring them into his dark realm, to have something living and beautiful in the land of death. Whether what he felt was love, or merely desire, or simply loneliness so deep it looked like love, we cannot know. But he took her, and having taken her, he tried to make her his wife, his queen, his companion in the eternal darkness. Ancient sources describe Persephone's initial response to her captivity in varying ways, but most emphasize her grief and resistance. She mourned, she wept, she refused to eat or drink anything offered to her. The underworld was her prison, Hades was her captor, and she wanted nothing except to escape and return to her mother. Some versions describe her sitting in silent mourning. Others have her actively resisting Hades' attempts to approach her. She would not accept her situation, would not acknowledge Hades as husband, would not cooperate with her forced marriage. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Persephone's situation grew more complex. The ancient texts suggest that Hades, while he had abducted her violently, did not simply rape her and leave her in prison. Instead, he tried to court her, to win her affection, to convince her that being queen of the underworld was not so terrible a fate. He offered her gifts, all the riches beneath the earth, all the precious metals and gems, all the wealth his dark kingdom contained. He showed her that she would have power here, authority over the dead, status as queen of a vast realm. He was not the cruel tyrant of later Christian imagination, but something more ambiguous. A god who had done a terrible thing but wanted his victim to forgive him, to accept him, to become his willing partner rather than his prisoner. And something in Persephone began to change. This transformation is one of the most psychologically complex elements of the myth. She did not forgive Hades. The ancient sources are clear about that. She did not fall in love with him, at least not in these earliest versions. But she began to understand her situation differently. She was no longer simply the core, the maiden, the girl who played in meadows and gathered flowers. She'd been through trauma, had seen death, had dwelled in darkness, had learned things her former innocent self could never have imagined. She was becoming someone new, no longer core, but Persephone, no longer maiden, but queen of the dead. This transformation is symbolized most powerfully in the pivotal moment of the entire myth, the eating of the pomegranate seeds. Different ancient sources tell this incident differently, and the variations are significant. In some versions, Hades tricks Persephone into eating pomegranate seeds just before Hermes arrives to rescue her, knowing that if she consumes any food from the underworld, she will be bound to remain there forever. In other versions, Persephone deliberately eats the seeds, knowing or suspecting their significance, choosing to bind herself to the underworld rather than return completely to her former life. In still other versions, the number of seeds varies, sometimes 3, sometimes 4, sometimes 6, sometimes 7, with each seed representing a month she must spend below. The pomegranate itself is rich with symbolism. Its blood-red seeds suggest fertility, life force, female, reproductive power. In Greek culture, pomegranates were associated with marriage, with sexuality, with womanhood. Breaking open a pomegranate and eating its seeds was suggestive of sexual initiation, of the bride's deflowering, of the loss of virginity. When Persephone ate pomegranate seeds in Hades' realm, she was symbolically accepting her transition from maiden to woman, from core to Persephone, from daughter to wife. But pomegranates also suggest death. Their red juice looks like blood. Their seeds are hidden inside, like secrets, like knowledge, like the mysteries of mortality. In ancient funeral practices, pomegranates were sometimes placed in graves, offerings to the dead, symbols of the hope for rebirth after death. When Persephone ate pomegranate seeds from the underworld, she was consuming death itself, taking mortality into her body, binding herself to the realm of the dead in a way that could never be completely undone. The significance of eating underworld food appears in many mythologies and fairy tales. The idea that consuming food offered by the dead binds you to their realm, that what you eat becomes part of you and makes you part of its world. In Greek belief, this binding was absolute. Once Persephone had eaten seeds from Hades' pomegranate, she belonged to the underworld in some fundamental way. She could leave, but she would have to return. She could be rescued, but never completely. She had tasted death, and death would always have a claim on her. Modern retellings sometimes present Persephone's eating of the pomegranate seeds as a choice, an act of agency in a situation where she had been stripped of agency. Perhaps she understood that she could not go back to being the innocent core who gathered flowers, that the trauma and transformation she had undergone could not be reversed. Perhaps she recognized that she had become someone new, someone powerful, queen of the dead, ruler of a vast realm, and that returning to her mother's protection would mean giving up that power. Perhaps she ate the seeds deliberately, binding herself to both worlds, ensuring she would be neither completely her mother's daughter nor completely Hades' wife, but something independent, split between realms, belonging fully to neither. Or perhaps she was simply hungry. After months of refusing food, perhaps Hades tricked her. Perhaps she didn't understand the significance of what she was eating. The ancient sources don't entirely agree, and perhaps that ambiguity is the point. Persephone's choice, or lack of choice, about the pomegranate seeds reflects the ambiguity of her entire situation. Was she victim or agent? Was she forced or did she choose? Was this tragedy or transformation? The answer seems to be all of the above, simultaneously, and possibly truthfully. What is clear is that by the time Hermes arrived to bring her back to the world above, Persephone had changed. She was no longer the girl who had been abducted. She had become something else, someone more complex, carrying both death and life within her, belonging to both darkness and light, split between her identity as Demeter's daughter and her new identity as Hades' queen. The core had died in the underworld's darkness, and Persephone had been born from that death. And this transformation, painful, traumatic, unwanted yet somehow necessary, would become the mythological explanation for the greatest transformation in nature itself, the changing of the seasons, which governed the compromise, birth of the seasons. When Hermes arrived in the underworld bearing Zeus's command to release Persephone, Hades could not simply refuse. Zeus was king of gods, and his word was law even in the realm of the dead. But Hades had a counter-argument that no one had anticipated, a fact that would change everything. Persephone had eaten food from the underworld. She had consumed pomegranate seeds, whether 3 or 4 or 6 or 7, depending on which version of the story you follow. And everyone knew the rule. Anyone who ate food in the underworld was bound to it forever. Hermes, confronted with this complication, had to carry the news back to the world above. Persephone could not be fully returned. The laws that governed the cosmos, older than the gods themselves, could not simply be overruled even by Zeus's command. What had been eaten could not be uneaten. What had been bound could not be completely unbound. Persephone belonged to the underworld now, at least in part, forever. Demeter's response when she learned this news was devastation, followed by renewed rage. She had waited. She had destroyed the world's fertility. To force Zeus to act, she had refused all compromise, all gifts, all pleading. And now she learned that even Zeus's command could not fully undo what Hades had done. Her daughter could not be completely returned. The violation could not be completely reversed. The loss could not be completely unmade. But Demeter was no longer powerless, no longer the dismissed goddess whose concerns Zeus had ignored. She had demonstrated her power through the famine. She had shown that she could not be brushed aside or overruled. The gods needed her cooperation. Humanity needed her blessing. And she would not give either unless she got something in return. If Persephone could not be fully returned, then Demeter would accept nothing less than a compromise that gave her the maximum possible time with her daughter. The negotiations that followed involved Zeus, Hades, Demeter, and perhaps other gods as mediators. Ancient sources don't give us the details of these divine discussions, but they tell us the outcome, a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but prevented total catastrophe for everyone. Persephone would be split between two worlds, two homes, two identities. For part of each year, she would dwell in the underworld as Hades' wife and queen. For the rest of each year, she would return to the world above to be with her mother. The exact proportion of time varied in different ancient versions. Some sources say Persephone would spend 3 months in the underworld and 9 with Demeter, perhaps originally matching 3 pomegranate seeds eaten. Others say 4 months below and 8 above, matching the agricultural calendar of the Mediterranean, where grain is stored underground during the hottest months and planted in the cooler season. The most common version eventually became 6 months in each realm, half the year as Queen of the Dead, half as Goddess of Spring and Demeter's daughter. This version, splitting the year equally, creates the most balanced symbolic pattern and aligns with the equinoxes that mark the sun's equal division of light and dark. Neither Demeter nor Hades were fully satisfied with this arrangement. Demeter wanted her daughter all the time, completely, the way things had been before. Hades wanted his wife to remain with him always, solidifying his claim to her and his right to have a companion in his lonely realm. But both had to accept the compromise, because neither could win completely. Zeus, in his role as king of gods and mediator of divine disputes, imposed this solution, and both parties grudgingly accepted it. For Persephone herself, the compromise was both liberation and continued imprisonment. She was not completely freed from Hades, not completely returned to her former life. She would forever be split between worlds, belonging fully to neither. Part of each year, she would live in darkness with her husband, far from her mother. Part of each year, she would dwell in light with her mother. Separated from her power as queen, she would never again know the complete unity of identity she had possessed as core. She would always be divided, always transitioning, always leaving someone and something behind. But the compromise also gave Persephone something unique among the gods. Dual nature, dual power, dual citizenship in realms that were normally separate and opposed. She alone among the Olympians could move freely between the world of the living and the world of the dead. She alone had authority both above and below. She was simultaneously maiden and queen, daughter and wife, life-bringer and death ruler. This made her extraordinarily powerful, if extraordinarily conflicted. When the compromise was finalized, Hermes brought Persephone back to the upper world to be reunited with Demeter. Ancient sources describe their reunion with joy and sorrow intermixed. Demeter held her daughter again after months of separation, felt her child's living warmth, looked into her face, and knew overwhelming relief and happiness. But Demeter also recognized immediately that her daughter had changed. Persephone was no longer the innocent core who had gathered flowers in meadows. She had seen death, had dwelled in darkness, had eaten from Hades' table, had become queen of the underworld. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Even when Persephone was with her mother, she would never be completely the girl she had been before. Persephone's own feelings about the reunion are less clearly described in ancient sources, but we can imagine the complexity. She loved her mother, certainly. She had missed Demeter desperately during her captivity, but she had also changed. She had power now, status, knowledge that the innocent core had never possessed. She had learned things about death and darkness and transformation that her mother, for all her ancient wisdom, had never experienced. She was returning home, but also leaving home, leaving Hades, leaving her identity as queen, leaving the underworld realm where she now had authority and purpose. But the most important outcome of the compromise was not the reunion of mother and daughter, however joyful or bittersweet. The most important outcome was that Demeter, having her daughter back, at least part of the time, agreed to restore fertility to the earth. She who had withheld her blessings now gave them again. Seeds that had refused to sprout now grew. Flowers that had withered now bloomed. Trees that had stood barren now bore fruit. The terrible winter, that first experience of the earth's death, came to an end, and life returned. But life could not return completely or permanently. Demeter's mood, her state of mind, her emotional condition now dictated the state of the earth itself. When Persephone was with her mother, when the two goddesses were reunited, when Demeter could see and hold her daughter, the goddess's joy translated into the earth's fertility. Spring came when Persephone emerged from the underworld, flowers blooming to welcome her, plants growing in celebration of her return. Summer reigned while mother and daughter were together, the earth producing abundance, crops ripening, harvests coming to fruition. But when the time came for Persephone to return to the underworld, when mother and daughter had to separate again, Demeter's grief returned. Her sorrow at losing her daughter, even though she knew the separation was temporary, even though she understood it would end, manifested in the earth's decline. Autumn came as Persephone descended, fruits harvested, leaves falling, plants dying back. Winter reigned while Persephone dwelt below, the earth barren, cold, seemingly dead, waiting in frozen grief for the goddess's return. This pattern would repeat forever. Every spring, Persephone would return, and Demeter would rejoice, and the earth would bloom. Every autumn, Persephone would descend again, and Demeter would mourn, and the earth would die. The changing seasons, which the Greeks had not experienced before Persephone's abduction, were now permanent features of existence, eternal cycles of death and rebirth, loss and reunion, grief and joy. Nature itself now reflected the emotional states of these two goddesses, forever bound together, forever separated, forever cycling between reunion and parting. The myth provided ancient Greeks with an explanation for why seasons change, why winter comes and spring returns, why the earth dies and is reborn each year. But more than just explaining a natural phenomenon, the myth captured something profound about loss and love, about separation and reunion, about how relationships and identities transform through trauma and time. Demeter and Persephone's story was not just about seasons in nature. It was about seasons in human life, the cycles of growth and decline, connection and separation, death and rebirth that all people experience. The compromise that created the seasons satisfied no one completely, yet it was the best resolution possible given the circumstances. Demeter got her daughter back, but not fully or permanently. Persephone was freed from captivity, but remained bound to her captor. Hades kept his wife, but only part-time. Zeus maintained order, but only by acknowledging a mother's power equaled his own. And humanity gained the seasons. The reliable pattern of spring, summer, autumn, winter that would govern agriculture, shape culture, and provide endless metaphorical meaning. From one family's tragedy came a pattern that would define all existence forever. The sacred mysteries of Eleusis. Before Persephone returned to the underworld for her first descent, after the compromise was reached, before she and Demeter separated again, the two goddesses revealed sacred knowledge to certain humans who had helped Demeter during her grief-stricken wandering. This revelation of divine secrets would become the foundation for the most important and influential mystery cult in all of ancient Greece, the Eleusinian Mysteries, which would persist for nearly 2,000 years until Christianity's rise ended the old religion. The people of Eleusis had shown kindness to Demeter when she came to their city disguised as an old woman. King Celeus and Queen Metaneira had taken her into their household, treated her with respect, trusted her with their infant son. The city had built a great temple for her when she revealed her divine identity. They had witnessed her grief and respected her pain, even when they couldn't fully understand it. In return for this hospitality and devotion, Demeter chose to give them something precious beyond measure: secret knowledge about death, the afterlife, and the soul's journey. According to ancient sources, Demeter taught these mysteries to several important figures in Eleusis. Triptolemus, a prince of Eleusis, in some versions the son of King Celeus, in others a separate figure, received from Demeter not only mystical knowledge but also practical gifts. The first grains of wheat, a wooden plow, and a divine chariot drawn by winged dragons. Demeter instructed Triptolemus to travel the world, teaching humanity the art of agriculture, showing people how to plant and harvest grain, spreading civilization through the knowledge of farming. Images of Triptolemus in ancient art often show him in his dragon-drawn chariot, carrying wheat, symbolizing the spread of agricultural knowledge that Demeter gave as a gift to humanity. But the sacred mysteries themselves were more profound and secret than the knowledge of agriculture. Demeter and Persephone together, the goddess who had searched and grieved, and the goddess who had died and been reborn, taught initiates about the nature of death and what comes after. The exact content of these teachings was kept absolutely secret. Initiates swore powerful oaths never to reveal what they experienced in the mysteries, and they kept those oaths so well that even now, thousands of years later, we don't know exactly what happened in the central rituals. Ancient writers who mention the mysteries do so vaguely, referring obliquely to what cannot be spoken, describing the effects of initiation without revealing its content. What we do know is that the Eleusinian Mysteries became one of the most important religious institutions in the ancient world. They were celebrated annually in the autumn during the month of Bodromion, roughly September-October, just around the time when Persephone would be descending to the underworld again. The mysteries took place over 9 days, deliberately echoing the 9 days of Demeter's search for her daughter. They involved two main components: the lesser mysteries, held in spring at a location called Agre, on the outskirts of Athens, which served as preliminary initiation, and the greater mysteries, held at Eleusis itself each autumn, which were the full and complete initiation. The greater mysteries began in Athens at the Eleusinion, a sanctuary dedicated to Demeter at the foot of the Acropolis. On the first day, sacred objects, the exact nature of which remains unknown, were brought in baskets from Eleusis to Athens, carried in procession by priestesses of the goddesses. Initiates gathered in Athens, and this is remarkable. Any Greek-speaking person could become an initiate, regardless of gender, social status, or origin, men and women, free and enslaved, Athenian citizens and foreigners, all were welcome to seek initiation. The only excluded categories were those who had committed murder and those who could not speak Greek to understand the rituals and teachings. On subsequent days, initiates performed purification rituals. They bathed in the sea at Phaleron, each accompanied by a piglet that would later be sacrificed. They underwent periods of fasting, breaking their fast only with a special drink called kikion, made from barley, water, and pennyroyal or mint. Interestingly, modern scholars have speculated that kikion might have contained ergot, a fungus that grows on barley and contains psychoactive alkaloids similar to LSD, potentially inducing altered states of consciousness that contributed to the profound visions initiates reported experiencing. Whether or not kikion was actually psychoactive remains debated, but something about the mysteries, whether biochemical, psychological, theatrical, or genuinely mystical, produced powerful transformative experiences. The climax of the mysteries came when initiates processed from Athens to Eleusis along the Sacred Way, a 14-mile journey that was marked by rituals at various points. They crossed bridges where they were ritually mocked and insulted, perhaps representing the dissolution of their former selves. They carried torches, echoing Demeter's torchlit search. They chanted ritual cries, Iacchus, O Iacchus, calling on a minor deity associated with the mysteries. When they finally arrived at Eleusis at night, exhausted from fasting and the long walk, they entered the sanctuary of Demeter. The central sacred building at Eleusis was called the Telesterion, the Hall of Initiation. This was an unusual structure for Greek architecture, rather than a typical temple with columns around the outside and a small inner chamber for the cult statue. The Telesterion was a large hall that could hold thousands of initiates simultaneously, all gathered around a central sacred space called the Anakteron, an inner chamber accessible only to the Hierophant, high priest. The Telesterion had been built and rebuilt several times over the centuries, growing larger to accommodate more initiates, until, in its final form, it could hold between 2,000 and 3,000 people. Inside the Telesterion, in complete darkness, broken only by torchlight, the secret rites took place. Ancient sources give us tantalizing hints without revealing actual content. The Hierophant performed certain actions, showed certain sacred objects, made certain revelations. Initiates recited a ritual password, confirming they had undergone the proper preparations. The password has been preserved. I fasted. I drank the kikion. I took from the basket, and after working, I placed in the basket and from the basket into the chest. This suggests ritual handling of sacred objects, though what these objects were remains unknown. At some climactic moment, initiates witnessed something that produced overwhelming emotional and spiritual response. Ancient sources describe bright light suddenly filling the previously dark hall. The Hierophant struck a gong. Some sources suggest a vision of Persephone herself appeared, perhaps represented by a priestess emerging from the Anakteron to symbolize the goddess's ascent from the underworld. Other sources mention the display of a single ear of wheat, cut in silence by the Hierophant, a simple image packed with meaning about death and rebirth, about how the grain must be cut to provide food, but contains seeds of its own renewal. The exact sequence and content of these visions and revelations is lost, but their effect is abundantly documented. Initiates reported that the mysteries transformed their understanding of death. They came away no longer fearing mortality, believing they had been shown proof of the soul's immortality and promised a blessed afterlife. The playwright Sophocles, who was himself an initiate, wrote, "Thrice blessed are those mortals who have seen these rites and go down to Hades, for they alone have true life there, while others find nothing but misery." The orator Cicero declared that Athens' greatest gift to humanity was not democracy or philosophy or art, but the Eleusinian mysteries, which had transformed humanity's relationship with death itself. What exactly did initiates learn that so profoundly changed them? Without knowing the specific content, we can infer from the context and symbolism. The mysteries were based on the myth of Demeter and Persephone, on the story of death and rebirth, loss and reunion, descent and return. Initiates underwent a symbolic death, fasting, darkness, isolation in the telesterion, and then experienced symbolic rebirth through the revelations, the light, the vision of Persephone ascending. They learned somehow that death is not an ending but a transition, that what seems lost is not truly gone, that the soul, like Persephone, like grain planted in earth, descends into darkness only to rise again transformed. The mysteries taught that life and death are cyclical, not linear, just as Persephone returns from the underworld each spring, just as cut grain produces new crops next year, just as seasons turn and nature eternally renews itself, so do human souls survive bodily death and continue in some form. Exactly what form, whether reincarnation, blessed existence in the underworld, immortality of the soul separate from body, the mysteries didn't spell out clearly, or if they did, initiates kept that secret. But the assurance was strong enough that people who underwent initiation reported complete transformation of their fear of death. The Eleusinian mysteries were celebrated annually from at least 1500 BCE until 392 CE, when the Christian Roman Emperor Theodosius the banned pagan worship throughout the empire for nearly 2,000 years. Generation after generation of Greeks and later Romans who adopted the mysteries, made the pilgrimage to Eleusis, underwent initiation, experienced the visions and revelations, and emerged transformed. Every important figure in classical Greek culture seems to have been initiated. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, statesmen like Pericles, playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides. The mysteries influenced Greek philosophy, particularly Plato's ideas about the immortal soul and the world of forms. They influenced how Greeks thought about death and the afterlife. They gave comfort to countless ordinary people facing mortality. And throughout this nearly 2 millennium history, initiates kept their oaths. There were very few attempts to reveal the secrets. Those who did violate their oath were severely punished. Death was the penalty for revealing the mysteries. The secrecy was maintained so well that even when Christianity finally suppressed the mysteries, even when temples were destroyed and priesthoods disbanded, even when there were no longer consequences for revealing what had been secret, the knowledge was lost. The last initiates took their secrets to their graves, and what happened in the telesterion remains unknown. What we're left with is the testimony of transformed lives, the witness of those who said the mysteries changed everything. The knowledge that for 2,000 years, people came to Eleusis seeking something profound about death and life, and found it. The Eleusinian mysteries were, in a very real sense, the gift Demeter gave humanity in return for the kindness the people of Eleusis showed her during her grief. She who had lost her daughter and nearly lost everything. She who had experienced the deepest sorrow and the greatest joy of reunion. She who knew death intimately through Persephone's fate. She taught others how to face death without despair, how to see endings as transitions, how to trust that what is lost may yet return. It was perhaps the most precious gift any god ever gave to mortals. Symbols, themes, and eternal meanings. The myth of Demeter and Persephone operates on multiple levels simultaneously. It's a story about individual characters, about cosmic forces, about natural cycles, about human psychology, about social structures, about spiritual truths. To understand its enduring power and relevance, we need to unpack the rich symbolism woven throughout the narrative and explore the universal themes it addresses. At the most literal level, the myth explains the changing seasons, providing ancient Greeks with an origin story for why the earth experiences cycles of growth and dormancy. Spring comes when Persephone returns from the underworld, the earth celebrating her release with flowers and new growth, embodying Demeter's joy at reunion. Summer flourishes while mother and daughter are together, the earth producing its bounty, crops ripening, the world reflecting their complete happiness. Autumn begins when Persephone must descend again, leaves falling like tears, fruits harvested, plants dying back in sympathy with Demeter's approaching grief. Winter reigns while Persephone dwells below, the earth barren and apparently dead, frozen in mourning until spring comes again. This explanation would have resonated deeply with agricultural societies completely dependent on seasonal cycles. The Greeks needed to understand why winter came, why crops failed at certain times, why the reliable fertility of the earth periodically withdrew. The myth made these frightening natural phenomena comprehensible as the emotional states of divine beings who loved each other, giving human scale emotional logic to cosmic scale natural forces. When winter was hard, when spring seemed delayed, farmers could think of Demeter mourning her daughter and have some emotional context for their hardship. But the seasonal explanation, while important, is almost the least interesting aspect of this rich myth. Far more profound is the symbolism of specific images and objects that recur throughout the story. The pomegranate is perhaps the most powerful and multivalent symbol in the entire myth. Its blood-red seeds suggest fertility, sexuality, female reproductive power. The fruit must be broken open to access its seeds, suggesting deflowering, loss of virginity, sexual initiation. In Greek culture, pomegranates were traditional wedding fruits, given to brides, symbolizing both fertility and the transition to womanhood through marriage. When Persephone ate pomegranate seeds in the underworld, she was symbolically accepting her transformation from maiden to wife, from girl to woman, acknowledging that she could not return to her former innocent state. But pomegranates also symbolize death. Their red juice resembles blood. Their seeds are hidden inside darkness, like secrets buried. In funerary contexts, pomegranates represented the paradox that death contains the seeds of new life, that endings harbor beginnings. The The pomegranate's hundreds of seeds in a single fruit suggest abundance, plurality, the many emerging from the one. When Persephone ate pomegranate seeds from the realm of death, she took mortality into herself, became familiar with death, if in a way that would allow her to rule there, bound herself to the cyclical pattern of death and rebirth that the seeds themselves represent. The number of seeds Persephone ate varied in different versions, and each variation created different symbolic meanings. 3 seeds might represent the 3 aspects of the triple goddess, maiden, mother, crone, or the 3 months of winter, or the tripartite nature of existence, birth, life, death. 4 seeds could represent the 4 seasons, the 4 directions, the wholeness of creation. 6 seeds created the most balanced symbolism, half the year in each realm, perfect balance between death and life, equal division between mother's claims and husbands. 7 seeds had mystical significance as a perfect number, representing completion and transformation. The Narcissus flower that lured Persephone to her doom carries its own profound symbolism. Narcissus was named after the mythological Narcissus, who fell in love with his own reflection and wasted away, eventually transforming into the flower that bears his name. The Narcissus thus represents vanity, self-absorption, beauty that leads to destruction. It's a flower beautiful enough to draw Persephone away from her companions, lovely enough to make her vulnerable, attractive enough to be fatal. It represents how beauty can be bait, how desire can be a trap, how what appears most attractive may be most dangerous. But the Narcissus's placement by Zeus, or Gaia at Zeus's command, also represents patriarchal complicity in female vulnerability. The flower was put there deliberately to make Persephone available for abduction. Male divine authority created the situation that led to her violation, just as fathers in Greek culture arranged marriages that daughters might not want. The Narcissus represents the treacherous nature of a world where beauty is both valued and dangerous for women, where being attractive makes one a target, where father's decisions can lead to daughter's suffering. Demeter's torch became one of her primary symbols, representing her frantic search for Persephone through days and nights, carrying light into darkness, refusing to stop looking, despite exhaustion and despair. The torch symbolizes maternal love that will not give up, that pushes past ordinary limitations, that brings illumination to dark places. In the mysteries, initiates carried torches during their nighttime procession from Athens to Eleusis, reenacting Demeter's search, symbolically seeking what has been lost, bringing light into their own darkness. But torches also represent the transition from darkness to light, the revelation that comes after ignorance, the illumination that transforms understanding. When initiates saw sudden light in the telesterion after darkness, when the Hierophant revealed whatever was revealed, that light represented enlightenment in both literal and metaphorical senses, physical illumination and spiritual understanding arriving together. Wheat and grain, Demeter's primary symbols, represent the fundamental paradox of agriculture. The seed must die to produce life. Grain harvested seems dead, cut, dried, stored in darkness. But those dead-seeming kernels contain potential for infinite life, the ability to produce new plants that will produce more grain in an endless cycle. The cut wheat displayed in the Eleusinian mysteries represented this paradox. Death that is not death, ending that is beginning, the promise that what seems destroyed will return. This symbolism extended to human existence. Bodies die and seem to end, but the soul, like the seed, contains something that survives and may produce new life, whether through literal reincarnation or through some other form of continuation. The agricultural metaphor made abstract spiritual concepts concrete and comprehensible. The pig, sacred to Demeter, seems an odd choice until you understand its connection to the earth. Pigs root in soil, turning it over, mixing it, fertilizing it. They're associated with chthonic underworld deities because they dig into the earth. At the Thesmophoria and other Demetrian festivals, piglets were thrown into pits where they would decompose, their bodies mixing with the soil to enhance fertility. The pig thus represented the necessary connection between death, decomposition, and new life. The same connection Persephone embodied by dwelling in the underworld and returning to bring spring. Beyond specific symbols, the myth explores profound themes about human experience and relationships. At its heart is maternal love portrayed as an unstoppable force of nature. Demeter's love for Persephone is so powerful, it can literally stop the world, make crops fail, bring famine, threaten humanity with extinction. This is not gentle, passive, nurturing love. This is fierce, protective, dangerous love that will destroy rather than accept loss. The myth validates maternal grief as legitimate and powerful, not something to be dismissed or contained, but something that must be acknowledged and addressed. The mother-daughter bond is presented as uniquely intense and significant. Demeter and Persephone are inseparable, identified with each other, worshipped together as the two goddesses. Their relationship transcends even death. Persephone's descent to the underworld doesn't end their bond, but transforms it into something eternal, a pattern of separation and reunion that will repeat forever. This reflects real psychological truths about how mothers and daughters are connected, how separation, whether through marriage, distance, or death, is painful for both parties, how the relationship continues even when physically separated. But the myth also acknowledges that separation is necessary and inevitable. Persephone cannot remain her mother's little girl forever. She must transform into something else. Woman, wife, queen. This transformation, while painful and, in the myth case, violent, is presented as necessary for Persephone to realize her full power in nature. She cannot become queen of the dead, cannot rule a vast realm, cannot possess dual authority over life and death, without leaving her mother's protection and becoming independent. The myth explores marriage as a form of death. The death of the maiden, the end of girlhood, the loss of innocence. In ancient Greek culture, marriage really did represent a kind of death for girls who left their mother's households to live with husbands' families, who lost their names and often their connections to birth families, who were expected to die to their former selves and be reborn as wives. The myth makes this metaphorical death literal. Persephone descends to the land of the dead when she marries Hades, truly dies as Kore, and is reborn as Persephone. But marriage in the myth is complicated by being also abduction and rape. The myth doesn't present marriage as inherently good or consensual. Persephone is taken by force. Zeus gives permission without asking her. Demeter has no say in her daughter's fate. This reflects real power dynamics in ancient Greek marriage, where fathers arranged marriages and daughters had little agency. The myth doesn't endorse this system. It shows the pain it causes, the rage it provokes in mothers, the trauma it inflicts on daughters. Modern feminist readings of the myth emphasize this aspect, seeing it not as justifying patriarchal marriage, but as exposing its violence. At the same time, the myth explores agency and choice within constrained circumstances. When Persephone eats the pomegranate seeds, especially in versions where she does so knowingly, she claims agency within her captivity. She cannot escape entirely, but she can ensure she won't be entirely trapped either. The compromise that results, split between realms, may not be ideal, but it's better than complete loss or complete captivity. This speaks to how people create agency within situations they didn't choose, how we make meaning from trauma, how we transform ourselves in response to violation. The death and rebirth pattern central to the myth extends beyond Persephone personally to represent universal cycles. Nothing dies permanently. Persephone returns, grain sprouts, spring comes, life renews, but nothing lives permanently either. Persephone descends, plants wither, winter comes, death recurs. The myth teaches acceptance of cyclical existence, understanding that endings are temporary, that beginnings contain their own endings, that all things transform continuously. This cyclical understanding opposes the linear thinking that dominates much modern culture, where we imagine progress as moving forward in a straight line toward some final goal. The ancient Greeks, agricultural people intimately familiar with natural cycles, understood time as circular. Seasons repeat. Generations replace each other. Patterns recur. The Demeter Persephone myth embodies this cyclical view, suggesting that wisdom lies in accepting recurrence rather than seeking permanent states. Modern psychological readings find many layers in the myth. Jungian analysis sees Demeter and Persephone as aspects of the Great Mother archetype, representing the dual nature of the feminine as both nurturing and transformative. The abduction represents the necessary descent into the unconscious, the dark night of the soul, the death of the ego that must occur for psychological growth. Persephone's return symbolizes integration, the emergence of a more complete self that incorporates both light and dark, conscious and unconscious, life and death. Feminist interpretations emphasize the myth's patriarchal framing, male gods making decisions about female deities, father and brother conspiring to take a woman from her mother, while also finding power in female resistance. Demeter refusing to accept Zeus's authority, using her control over agriculture to force negotiation, demonstrates that women possess power even in patriarchal systems. The mother-daughter bond resisting patriarchal separation represents female solidarity, women supporting women against male control. Environmental readings see the myth as warning about humanity's relationship with nature. Demeter's withdrawal of fertility represents what happens when we violate the earth. Famine, death, destruction follow. Her eventual restoration of growth shows that right relationship with natural cycles is possible, but requires respecting natural law, acknowledging limits, accepting that some forces cannot be permanently controlled or contained. All these interpretations, seasonal, agricultural, psychological, feminist, spiritual, environmental, coexist within the myth, without contradicting each other. The Demeter Persephone story contains multitudes, speaks to many aspects of human experience simultaneously, resonates across cultures and eras because it touches something universal about loss and return, death and rebirth, separation and reunion, grief and hope. It's a story about seasons and about souls, about mothers and daughters, about violation and agency, about death and the promise that death is not final. It's been told and retold for 3,000 years, and will be told 3,000 more because the truths it embodies don't change, even as human cultures transform. Legacy and modern resonance. When the Romans conquered Greece, they adopted Greek mythology wholesale, giving Roman names to Greek gods, but maintaining most of the stories intact. Demeter became Ceres, from whose name we derive the English word cereal, emphasizing her agricultural identity. Persephone became Proserpina or Proserpine. The myth remained essentially unchanged in its Roman versions, though Roman telling sometimes emphasized different aspects or added details reflecting Roman cultural concerns. The poet Ovid included the story in his Metamorphoses, ensuring that Latinate versions of the names would persist in Western literature. Roman worship of Ceres was important and elaborate. The Cerealia, Ceres' major festival, was celebrated in mid-April with games, sacrifices, and theatrical performances. Ceres was especially associated with the plebeian class, the common people, perhaps because bread and grain were fundamental to everyone, but especially crucial to those without wealth. Roman matrons would fast for 9 days during the Cerealia, echoing Demeter's 9-day search for Persephone, creating ritualized community mourning that brought women together and validated their grief. The Eleusinian mysteries survived the transition from Greek to Roman control, remaining active and influential throughout the Roman period. Many prominent Romans underwent initiation at Eleusis, including the emperors Marcus Aurelius and his son Commodus. The mysteries continued to promise transformation and hope about the afterlife, operating parallel to but distinct from Roman state religion. They were finally suppressed in 392 CE by Christian Emperor Theodosius I's decree banning all pagan worship, and the sanctuary at Eleusis was destroyed by Visigoth invaders in 396 CE. The early Christians had complicated relationships with the Demeter-Persephone myth, and particularly the Eleusinian mysteries. Some Christian writers attacked the mysteries as demonic deceptions, corruptions of truth, false promises of salvation. Others found concerning parallels between mystery cult promises and Christian teachings. Both offered initiates transformation. Both promised blessed afterlife. Both involved symbolic death and rebirth. Early Christian fathers sometimes argued that Satan had deliberately created pagan mysteries as false versions of Christianity to confuse humanity, attempting to explain away the suspicious similarities. But Christianity also absorbed elements from the older religion. The imagery of seeds dying in earth to produce life was used by early Christian writers to explain Christ's death and resurrection. St. Paul wrote that, "Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone, but if it dies, it bears much fruit," directly deploying agricultural metaphors from Demetrian religion in Christian context. The promise of blessed afterlife for initiates Chaos believers, the ritualized communal meals, the emphasis on transformation through ritual. These parallels suggest that Christianity and mystery religions were competing within similar spiritual territory. Medieval and Renaissance European culture, dominated by Christianity, didn't directly worship Demeter or celebrate her mysteries, but her mythology remained known through classical texts. Medieval illuminated manuscripts sometimes depicted scenes from her story. Renaissance artists Fascinated by classical mythology, returned to Demeter Persephone as subject matter for painting and sculpture. Bernini's magnificent sculpture, The Rape of Proserpina, 1621-1622, captures the moment of abduction with disturbing realism. Hades' stone fingers pressing into Persephone's flesh, her marble tears, her obvious resistance. This masterwork makes the violence explicit, forcing viewers to confront the trauma at the myth's heart rather than romanticizing it. The pre-Raphaelite movement of Victorian England found Persephone particularly fascinating. Dante Gabriel Rossetti painted her multiple times, always emphasizing her divided nature, showing her holding the pomegranate and looking neither happy nor entirely sad, caught between worlds, eternally in transition. Frederick Lord Leighton's The Return of Persephone, 1891, depicts the moment of mother-daughter reunion, with Demeter reaching for Persephone, who ascends from darkness toward light, surrounded by attending figures representing different aspects of the myth's meaning. Victorian fascination with the myth reflected contemporary concerns about women's roles, mother-daughter relationships, marriage as death of maidenhood, concerns surprisingly similar to those the ancient Greeks had 3,000 years earlier. Modern retellings of the Demeter Persephone myth proliferate across media: novels, poems, plays, films, graphic novels, video games. Some follow the traditional story closely. Others radically reinterpret it, often giving Persephone more agency, sometimes making Hades less villainous, occasionally recasting the abduction as willing flight from overprotective mother. Margaret Atwood's poem cycle, The Persephone Variations, explores multiple interpretations. Madeline Miller's novel, Circe, includes a brief but moving Demeter Persephone section. Young adult fantasy novels frequently deploy the myth structure: girl taken to underworld, mother searching desperately, compromise allowing partial return, seasonal symbolism throughout. Feminist reinterpretations have been particularly influential. Writers and scholars have explored how the myth can be read as validating female rage, female grief, female resistance to patriarchal control. Demeter refusing Zeus, destroying the world to force return of her daughter, demonstrates that women possess power even within patriarchal systems. Persephone eating pomegranate seeds, in versions where this is deliberate choice, shows women claiming agency even in captivity. The mother-daughter bond surviving despite forced separation represents female solidarity and love transcending male attempts to divide women. Modern feminist versions sometimes portray Persephone as wanting to leave Demeter, seeing the abduction as liberation from overprotective mother rather than violation by predatory god. These retellings explore mother-daughter relationships, potential for toxic closeness, mother's difficulties letting daughters individuate, daughters' need to establish independent identities. While controversial because they risk justifying abuse, these interpretations recognize complexity in the mother-daughter bond that the original myth also acknowledges. Demeter's protectiveness was excessive. Persephone needed to grow beyond her mother's shadow, even if the method of separation was traumatic. Environmental readings find new relevance in the myth as climate change threatens seasonal stability. Demeter's withdrawal of fertility due to grief and rage mirrors how human activity damages Earth's capacity to sustain life. The myth warns that we cannot take nature's generosity for granted, that violating natural law has consequences, that the Earth will not support us indefinitely if we abuse it. Persephone's cyclical return represents hope that patterns can be restored, that what seems broken might yet be healed, but also warns that some changes, like eating underworld seeds, cannot be undone. Some environmental damage is permanent. Psychological and therapeutic applications of the myth help people process grief, trauma, mother-daughter relationships, life transitions. Therapists use Demeter's story to validate parental grief when children leave or are lost. They use Persephone's transformation to discuss how trauma changes identity, how we become different people through suffering, how returning home after trauma means returning as someone new. The seasonal cycle offers hope to those in dark times. Winter ends, spring comes. Pain is not permanent, even when it feels eternal. Modern neo-pagan and Wiccan movements have revived worship of Demeter and Persephone, celebrating seasonal festivals connected to their myth, performing rituals that echo or imagine ancient mysteries. While these modern practices are reconstructions rather than unbroken traditions, the ancient mysteries' content being lost, they demonstrate the myth's continuing spiritual resonance for people seeking meaning in nature's cycles, mother-daughter relationships, and death's mysteries. In popular culture, Persephone appears in countless adaptations. Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series, the video game Hades, which won awards for its sympathetic portrayal of the underworld gods, Netflix series, and webcomics and Broadway shows. Each adaptation makes choices about how to portray the central relationships, whether to emphasize trauma or transformation, whether Hades is villain or complex figure, whether Persephone chooses or is forced, whether Demeter's protectiveness is loving or smothering. The continuing relevance and power of this 3,000-year-old story speaks to how deeply it touches universal human experiences. Everyone knows loss. Everyone has experienced or witnessed grief. Everyone understands what it is to be separated from those we love. Parents universally struggle with letting children go. Children universally need to individuate, even when it hurts parents. Everyone faces the reality of death and wonders what lies beyond. The Demeter-Persephone myth addresses all these experiences through the lens of divine drama, making the personal cosmic and the cosmic personal. It tells us that grief is powerful and legitimate, that motherly love is a force of nature, that loss transforms us utterly, that nothing is permanent, neither joy nor sorrow, neither connection nor separation, neither life nor death. It promises that spring comes after winter, that reunion follows separation, that what descends will rise again. It warns that some transformations cannot be reversed, that eating certain seeds binds us forever, that agency within constraint is still agency, even if the constraints remain. Most fundamentally, the myth tells us that we are like seeds. We die and are reborn. We descend into darkness and emerge transformed. We contain within ourselves the promise of continuation beyond our individual existence. Whether we interpret this spiritually as immortal souls, biologically as genes passing to children, or mimetically as ideas and influences outliving us, the basic pattern holds. What seems to end continues in new forms. Death is transition, not termination. Nothing is truly lost, even when it seems completely gone. This is why the Demeter-Persephone myth has survived 3 millennia and will survive many more. It speaks truths too deep for rational discourse, truths that can only be conveyed through story and symbol and mystery. It doesn't answer questions about death and loss so much as it helps us live with those questions, helps us understand that not knowing is part of human condition, helps us accept cycles we cannot control. Every spring when flowers bloom and the world turns green, every autumn when leaves fall and the earth grows cold, every time a mother watches her daughter grow up in a way, every time someone we love leaves or dies, the ancient myth remains relevant because human nature doesn't change, even when human culture does. Demeter still mourns, Persephone still returns, and the seasons still turn. Eternal patterns that give meaning to our temporary lives. Conclusion, and so we reach the end of our journey through the most sorrowful and hopeful myth that ancient Greece produced. The story of Demeter and Persephone, the great mother and her stolen daughter, whose love for each other created the seasons that turn from birth to death to rebirth, endless and eternal. We follow Demeter through her frantic search, her unbearable grief, her rage powerful enough to threaten all existence. We've descended with Persephone into darkness, witnessed her transformation from innocent core into dual-natured queen of the dead. We have seen how maternal love refused to accept loss, how a mother's grief brought the world to its knees, how compromise created the pattern of spring's joy and winter's sorrow that defines our experience of time. This myth, 3,000 years old, remains as relevant today as when it was first told. Every mother who has ever feared for a child, every daughter who has ever struggled with independence from a loving but overprotective parent, every person who has ever experienced loss and wondered if what's gone might somehow return. All of these find their stories reflected in Demeter and Persephone's ancient tragedy. The myth teaches us that grief is legitimate and powerful, that love transcends even death, that loss transforms us but need not destroy us, that endings are not permanent because everything moves in cycles. Spring comes, it always comes, even after the longest winter, even when we're certain that cold and darkness will last forever. Eventually warmth returns, and the earth blooms again. Persephone rises from the underworld, Demeter rejoices, and life renews itself, as it has done since the beginning of time and will continue doing until time itself ends. This is the promise and hope at the heart of the myth, that winter is not the end, that death is not final, that what descends will rise, that reunion follows separation, that the seeds we plant in darkness will sprout in the light. If you've enjoyed this deep exploration into the sorrowful tale of Demeter and Persephone and the birth of seasons, please like this video and subscribe to the Mythos Deep Dive. Your support helps us continue bringing you these rich, detailed examinations of Greek mythology, where gods and mortals struggle with eternal questions about love, loss, grief, hope, and the cycles of existence that define all life. Share this with anyone interested in mythology, mother-daughter relationships, the meaning of seasons, or the ancient wisdom that remains relevant in our modern world. Let us know in the comments which aspect of the Demeter-Persephone myth resonated most deeply with you, or which deity or hero you would like us to explore next in our ongoing journey through the fascinating landscape of Greek mythology. Remember, whenever you feel lost in winter's darkness, whenever loss seems permanent and grief seems endless, that Persephone will rise again, that spring will come, that the eternal cycle of death and rebirth continues, whether we understand it or not. May you find comfort in the turning seasons. May your winters be brief and your springs joyful, and may the eternal bond between those who love transcend all separations, just as Demeter and Persephone remain forever connected despite being forever divided. Stay curious, my friends, and may the Great Mother watch over your plantings and your harvests.